Good afternoon, folks. I hope everybody is doing well today. This is going to be the first lesson in my lecture on first lecture in my lesson, I suppose, on circulatory systems in the kingdom Animalia. If you are in my general biology class, I strongly recommend that you go on the Blackboard site and get a copy of the handout and lecture notes summary before you continue with this so that you have some important terminology in front of you spelled out for your reference. Now, all animals, as you know, require energy and raw materials and gases that they get from their environment. All animals require oxygen for aerobic respiration. All animals require water in order to carry out important chemical functions. All animals require the various nutrients obtained from diet as a source of both energy and raw materials. Furthermore, all animals, in addition to having to take stuff in, also need ways of sending stuff out. All animals need a way of disposing of the various metabolic wastes that result from their biologic processes, whether that would be chemicals like urea that are a byproduct of cellular metabolism, whether that would be carbon dioxide that is a byproduct of aerobic respiration, or any wide variety of other things that produce chemicals that the body does not need and needs to dispose of. Now, here's the thing. You as an animal are constantly requiring intake of a lot of different materials, and you're also requiring the ability to send out stuff that the cells don't need anymore. But most cells in your body do not have direct access to the external environment. Think about it. You've got this layer of cells on the outside of you. You've got the epidermal cells of your skin. You have a couple of other open epithelial tissues, but for the most part, the external cells on your body are dead. Most epithelial cells on the surface are dead cells, providing a protective barrier against environmental forces. And B, most of those cells most of your cells are not on the surface. The overwhelming majority of the 100 trillion or so cells in your body are deeper down. They are further inside the body, many, many cell layers deep. As a consequence of this, folks, most cells in the animal body do not have direct access to the nutrient and gas exchange they require to function. Most cells are unable to, for themselves, collect the molecules they require or send out the wastes that they are putting out. For that reason, the majority of animals are going to require specialized organ systems as a mechanism for delivering the materials that the body requires and carrying away the waste materials. In other words, we need a mechanism of fluid exchange. And I say fluid exchange because we need a mechanism for moving things around within the body that is fundamentally an aqueous mechanism. We need to be able to dissolve gases, minerals, nutrients, and other things and freely circulate them. And you're going to need a liquid medium if you want to move them effectively from point A to point B within a living system. You're going to need something that can flow through passageways or ducts of some sorts. And this gets us to our topic today, namely circulatory systems. That most animals have some form of circulatory system providing bulk fluid transport throughout the body. That bulk fluid transport requires you to have a liquid base of some kind, a fluid like blood or something similar to it, in which nutrients, gases, metabolic wastes, and other essential chemicals can be dissolved or suspended. My circulatory system has to do a couple of things. One, it has to provide effective transport of materials. It has to effectively move things from point A to point B. Those things that are being moved could be food molecules, amino acids derived from our proteins, fatty acids derived from our lipids, carbohydrates. Those things could be vitamins and minerals taken from our food. Those things could be proteins that are secreted by one cell or another, hormones, for example, that are released by a gland and need to go somewhere else in the body. Those things could be waste materials released by cells, which then can be transported to organs that can remove them from the body. Those things could even just be water. Water itself is a thing that needs to be moved around to help out the body with a wide variety of chemical functions. So that's one thing our circulatory system has to do. It has to be able to move around bulk fluids containing a wide variety of things that are, suspended within them. Secondly, our circulatory system needs to have mechanisms for rapid diffusion in order to take things in and release them. It is not just good enough to have a bloodstream that can move nutrients around in the body. That isn't going to be helpful unless we have a mechanism to transfer those nutrients from the digestive tract into the blood, and then another mechanism to transport them from the bloodstream out into the tissues that require them. Likewise, we can't move oxygen and carbon dioxide around unless we have some kind of membrane that allows the exchange between the circulatory system and the respiratory system. So a circulatory system doesn't just have to move stuff. It also has to have setups that allow it to rapidly take in needed compounds from the environment to the body, and then to release things that are not needed from the tissues into the bloodstream to be carried away. So circulatory system is going to have to do both of those jobs. Now, obviously, a circulatory system is going to be integrated closely with other bodily systems. That you're going to see a close connection between circulatory and respiratory systems. The respiratory system, of course, is any set of structures involved in the action of gas exchange, the action of moving oxygen into the body, moving carbon dioxide out of the body. That is closely integrated with the circulatory system so that the animal can get the gases it needs and get rid of the gas wastes. Likewise, there has to be a close integration between the circulatory system and the digestive system, whereby the animal can absorb the nutrients released from digestion and carry them to the parts of the body that require them. By having the circulatory system coupled with other systems in this way, it's not necessary for the animal to have every cell in direct contact with the environment. Not every cell in my body needs to be directly touching the air in order to get gas exchange, because I have a respiratory system that brings the gases into the body, and then a circulatory system which dissolves those gases and moves them through the body to all of the tissues that need them. As long as those cells are in contact with the bloodstream, or in some cases, even as long as they're in contact with another cell that's in contact with the bloodstream, they can get the gas exchange they need without having to do it for themselves. Likewise, not every cell has to be in contact with an environment where it can collect its own nutrients, because we have a digestive system that brings those nutrients into the body, and the circulatory system couples with that to absorb those nutrients and then move them around and distribute them to all of the many cells that are not in direct contact with that nutrient supply. So by having a circulatory system, we get around the problem of a thick-bodied animal whose cells are not all touching the external environment, but still needs to get things from the external environment or release things into it. The bloodstream is the bridge for that. Well, I say bloodstream. I shouldn't say bloodstream, because we're going to find that some animals do it a little bit differently than blood. I should say the circulatory system. And that brings up another point that I want to mention. Note that I am saying circulatory system and not cardiovascular system. Many animals have a circulatory system. Not all animals have a cardiovascular system. And we're going to talk about the differences a little bit further as we get along here. So let's start with taking a look at circulation in the invertebrate world. You've all learned by now that invertebrates are, in general, a lot less complex than vertebrates in terms of anatomy and structures. And so invertebrates are going to do this a little bit differently than you do in most instances. There are several different circulatory strategies used by invertebrates to get the nutrients and gases that they require to where they need to go. Now, first off, I should point out that the very simplest situations do not require a circulatory system at all. There are, in fact, some animals in which every cell of the body is either in direct contact with the environment or is within a cell or two of something that is. Ergo, in those cases, the animal doesn't need a specialized circulatory system to get stuff around. A couple of examples. Sponges. You all know by now the sponge is the exception to almost every rule involving greater complexity in the kingdom Animalia, that the phylum Porifera, the sponges and their affiliates, is going to be a phylum lacking distinct tissues, let alone organ systems. The porous body of a sponge has lots and lots of tiny openings that water filters in through. Nearly every cell in the sponge's body is either in direct contact with a fluid-filled compartment or is adjacent to a cell that is. In that way, cells that are in contact either with the external fluids around the sponge or with the fluids flowing into its body and its spongocele from the environment, all of those cells can engage in direct nutrient and gas exchange with the surrounding environment. They can absorb oxygen directly from the water flowing over them. They can absorb nutrients that are being filtered out of that water as well. They can release their waste gases and waste materials directly into that water. And the few cells that are not in direct contact with a water supply are in contact with a cell that is. Ergo, that highly porous body of the sponge with water flowing all through it ensures that every cell of the sponge is in relatively close proximity to a place where nutrient and gas exchange can happen. Let's go a little bit more complex. Let's go to an animal that actually has tissues. Let's look at the cnidarians. As you know, phylum Cnidaria is also a pretty simple group of animals. Now remember that cnidarians have sort of a sac-shaped body, like a bag-like body with a single big internal cavity, a space within that bell-shaped body, which you might recall from our last chapter is called the gastrovascular cavity. Gastro for stomach, vascular for vessels, because the gastrovascular cavity is fulfilling the functions of both a digestive system and a circulatory system. The cnidarian's body wall, whether you're talking about your jelly, your hydra, your coral, whatever, the body wall itself is only, in most cases, 2 cell layers thick, 2 or 3 in some species. The gastrovascular cavity forming the lining, forming the inside of the animal's body, that's the entire internal space, has, you might recall, a single opening with the external environment that is continuous with the external environment. There's no sphincter, there's no closure. That animal's hollow body is always filled with fluids that are always being exchanged with the water around it. The lining of that gastrovascular cavity is an absorption membrane, which is capable of absorbing both oxygen and nutrients from the surrounding water. And then, because the animal's body is only 2 cell layers thick, those absorptive cells in the lining can easily pass those gases and nutrients to the cells adjacent to them. Likewise, waste materials can be released directly across that membrane, diffusing out of the animal's body and into the gastrovascular cavity, where they can be passed out when the animal's body wall contracts and squeezes water out and circulates more back in. It's not as efficient as a circulatory system in the way that we understand it, especially because it's only got one opening for both ingress and egress. However, does what the animal needs it to do. It effectively delivers both gases and nutrients to every cell of its body. If I am a flatworm, flatworms, members of the phylum Platyhelminthes, like our planaria that we talked about in a previous lab activity. They are called flatworms for a reason. Their body wall is also very thin, only 2 cell layers thick. The entire external surface of the animal's body acts as a respiratory membrane for taking in gases and releasing carbon dioxide. Your flatworm does have internal digestion, but its digestive compartment is also only 1 cell layer away from the rest of the cells in the body. Ergo, that singular digestive compartment can easily pick up nutrients through its lining, diffuse them in there, and then get them rapidly to every other cell in the animal's body. So my flatworm also doesn't need a circulatory system. So basically, when I'm talking about a flat-bodied animal or a porous animal, in these very simple phyla of life, circulatory systems are not required. If you've got a body in which every cell is at most a cell or two away from an absorptive membrane, you don't need specialized fluid transport mechanisms to move stuff around, because most cells can, in fact, get what they need directly or very easily from an adjacent cell. Gets more complicated, of course, once you begin developing a thicker, multi-layered body wall. Once I have a body wall that is more than 2 or maybe 3 cell layers thick, now I'm in a situation where not every cell is in easy proximity to either an absorption membrane or another cell that is. Look at your body. You've got 30 layers of cells just on the surface of your skin, to say nothing of the deeper tissue underneath. In these cases, when not every cell is easily in contact with a nutrient or gas supply, at least not with a way of getting it for itself, that's when a circulatory system is required. That's when the animal needs a fluid transport mechanism to move things around within its tissue and to bring it into contact with the supplies that it needs. You could have absorptive membranes located in specialized organs, like respiratory organs and digestive organs, and then you use a circulatory system to pick up the things absorbed through those particular absorption points and move them around. And as long as every cell is either in direct contact with the fluid exposure from that circulatory system, or it's in contact with another cell that can get that fluid exposure, then that animal's fine. That circulatory system allows effective movement of the nutrients and gases penetrating that multi-layered body wall, so that at the end of the day, even if every cell is not close to an absorptive membrane, it doesn't need to be. The fluid medium can bring it the stuff that it requires from those structures that are. Now, that's a more complex body plan, obviously. You can support a lot more kinds of activities. You can do more things with a more complex body plan. The cost, evolutionarily speaking, is greater complexity requires more maintenance. You need more energy, you need more oxygen, and you also have specialized organ systems and parts where things can go wrong with them, and the rest of the system collapses if they do. You're not going to last very long if your lungs stop working. Likewise, if your circulatory system stops working and the rest of your cells can't get anything, well, that's what happens when you have a heart attack, right? Your heart stops pumping blood, and you last maybe 5 minutes after that without medical intervention. So, benefits and drawbacks. Benefit of a circulatory system is effective transmission of materials to all of the parts of a more complex, larger, thicker walled body. Drawback, of course, is the higher maintenance costs, both energetically and in terms of raw materials for running and maintaining this system, and the possibility that the breakdown of specialized parts will lead to a systemic failure. So that's our evolutionary benefit drawback equation. On the whole, it tends to benefit complex life. Now, not all circulatory systems are the same. Not all circulatory systems are equally complex. Among invertebrates, we are going to find what we call both open and closed circulatory systems. If you have an open circulatory system is one in which there are no distinct vessels for carrying around nutrient-bearing fluid. In other words, there are no arteries, there are no veins, there are no blood vessels. In an open circulatory system, we call it open because there is no distinction between blood and interstitial tissue fluid. Remember, we talked about interstitial fluid back when we talked about tissues, the fluid matrix, the extracellular fluids that are found throughout your body. If you have an open circulatory system, there is no distinction between that and your bloodstream. It's all one set of fluids surrounding your cells internally, moving through cavities within the body called sinuses. So if I'm an animal with an open circulatory system, I'm going to have a singular fluid that functions as both blood and tissue fluid. It's often called hemolymph, H-E-M-O-L-Y-M-P-H. Hemo for blood, lymph for, well, lymph is the tissue fluid that you find in most animals. And so this fulfills the functions of both. You will find that in your open circulatory systems, because there are not distinct blood vessels, you're instead going to have just a series of branching sinuses, of passageways, and of cavities within the body, which branch smaller and smaller until they reach almost every cell. You will find that open circulatory systems usually do have at least one heart, sometimes more than one heart, to drive the movement of fluid, to keep it moving around within those sinuses and thereby effectively moving gases and nutrients and wastes from where they start to where they need to be. Now, you will find also that open circulatory systems are commonly going to operate through the action of body movements, that the animal's body, as it moves around, rhythmically squeezes the sinuses through muscular action. And as such, that animal is benefiting as much from the propulsion of hemolymph via its normal locomotion as it is from the action of particular hearts. So that's a way that you can do this. You'll find open circulatory systems primarily in arthropods, but a few other invertebrate phyla have them as well. Now, then there are closed circulatory systems. A closed circulatory system is a bit more familiar to us because in a closed circulatory system, there is a distinction between blood and tissue fluid. The tissue fluid is just, in spaces between the cells. It is truly interstitial fluid. It is lymph. The blood, however, is confined to distinct blood vessels, that in a closed circulatory system, you're going to have a heart, typically a single heart, and some taxa more than one heart, that pumps blood in a dedicated pathway through a series of vessels. And you're going to have fluid and nutrient exchange between the walls of those vessels and the tissues that they permeate. And those vessels branch out small and smaller and smaller and penetrate virtually every tissue in the animal's body, thereby delivering gases and nutrients and carrying away metabolic wastes. So a closed circulatory system is going to have these dedicated paths. Blood is moving in a specific process along specific tubes that are designed to carry it, and exchange happens between the smallest of those tubes and the tissue in order to get the things that we need. We are going to find some example animals with closed circulatory systems. Earthworms, members of phylum Annelida, have closed circulatory systems. Your cephalopods, your squid, your octopus, your cuttlefish, those animals have closed circulatory systems. And you, as a vertebrate, have a closed circulatory system. All vertebrates have closed circulatory systems. Benefit drawback, we have to talk about this here. Open circulatory systems are fairly energetically inexpensive and structurally unsophisticated. They are not all that complex. They are really relatively easy to maintain from an energetic standpoint. The animal does not need an elaborate internal network of blood vessels and so forth. And although it does have a heart-like pump, in some cases having redundant pumps, more than one heart, means that even damage to one of them can result in the animal still being able to get by, especially if that animal is also relying on the contractions of its body walls to squeeze lymph through the sinuses. Hemolymph, excuse me, not lymph. Drawback of a hemolymph-based open circulatory system is going to be a lack of efficiency. Because you are not moving the hemolymph through a dedicated channel with a specific directional pathway, that means that you can't guarantee that all portions of the fluid are getting equal access to nutrients, to gases coming in from the membranes that absorb those things, and you can't guarantee that all tissues are getting equal circulation of those things at all times. You cannot be an endotherm with an open circulatory system. It just straight up isn't an option, because endothermy requires a very consistent and specific and regular distribution of both energy and oxygen to maintain the very high metabolic rate. So if you've got an open circulatory system, you are by necessity an ectotherm. Now, how about a closed circulatory system? Closed circulatory systems benefit from having a directed pathway of blood. There is more efficiency in the delivery of gases and nutrients. They are following dedicated pathways. They are going in a unidirectional flow. We are continuously replenishing the supply of nutrients and gases as the blood is directed to organs where those things are absorbed, picks them up, carries them back to the tissues, drops them off, picks up the metabolic wastes, and then continues the cycle. So a closed circulatory system provides a regular and efficient and predictable distribution of nutrients and gas exchange between the organ systems that do those things and the rest of the tissues of the body. Downsides of a closed circulatory system: one, more complexity, more structures to maintain, lots of blood vessels, usually a heart that is a very central and highly energetically demanding structure, since it has to keep this thing going continuously, and it's typically the only thing that is driving that flow to any significant extent. Furthermore, you will find that breaks in a closed circulatory system are quite dangerous. That if you rupture those dedicated vessels that carry your blood around, then you run the possibility of losing your primary medium of gas and fluid exchange. You run the possibility of losing pressure within the system. You can die from bleeding to death. And any break in the system reduces the efficiency by which it delivers the stuff needed to your tissue, and also provides dangerous possibilities for getting pathogens moved around along a clear and obvious pathway as well. So energetic costs and the danger posed by having a breakdown in that specialized system are the chief drawbacks that we have of a closed circulatory system. But we will find that a closed circulatory system, whether you are a vertebrate or an invertebrate, allows for a more active lifestyle. Animals that with a closed circulatory system can sustain prolonged activity better. They tend to be more active hunters when they are predators. They tend to move around more. And they tend to, in many cases, be more intelligent because you can supply more energy more effectively to the demands of a powerful brain. It is not a coincidence that the cephalopods with a closed circulatory system are the most intelligent, active predators among all invertebrates. So that's kind of our basic difference there. Now, another thing I should mention, however, that there is a benefit to an open circulatory system that closed circulatory systems do not provide, that when you have all these fluid-filled cavities distributed throughout the animal's body, those fluid-filled cavities can behave as a hydrostatic skeleton. Remember, we talked about hydrostatic skeleton before being basically fluid-filled compartments that can provide mechanical advantage for purposes of locomotion, for moving things around within the body of the animal. And as such, and actually for that, more to that point, for moving the animal itself around. If you're an invertebrate and you don't have a skeleton, having a hydrostatic skeleton is a really effective way of giving your muscles mechanical advantage to act on. So that's another thing that your open circulatory system provides. In many ways, it obviates the need for a skeletal system. All right, so open versus closed circulatory systems. Obviously, open circulatory systems are a lot simpler. They don't have as many parts. They're pretty straightforward. You've got sinuses throughout the body. You have one or more hearts, possibly to helping keep stuff pumping and moving around, but you don't have a directional flow. Obviously, a closed circulatory system requires a greater degree of structural complexity. A closed circulatory system can be what we call a cardiovascular system. Cardiovascular, C-A-R-D-I-O-V-A-S-C-U-L-A-R, cardiovascular. Cardio for hearts, vascular for vessels. So a cardiovascular system relies on a network of blood vessels attached to a heart. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to talk about the complexities involved in a closed circulatory system because we are vertebrates. Let's talk about the vertebrate circulatory system and see how a closed circulatory system works in an animal like ourselves. Vertebrates, in many respects, as you've learned well by now, are the most anatomically complex members of the animal kingdom, and as such, having an understanding of their specialized structures is really important. All right, so looking at our closed circulatory system, central part of this obviously is the heart. The heart is a muscular organ, typically located somewhere centrally in the body mass. The heart in a closed circulatory system is usually found pretty centrally within the body. We, of course, locate our heart more or less centrally within our thoracic cavity. There's a special space between the lungs, if you don't know this term, called the mediastinum, M-E-D-I-A-S-T-I-N-U-M. The mediastinum is the cavity between the lungs where the heart resides. Now, the heart being a fairly central structure, hearts are pretty universal in their basic tissue composition. Vertebrate hearts are all composed primarily of cardiac muscle. You might recall I mentioned cardiac muscle as a special kind of muscle tissue. Cardiac muscle has adaptations that other tissues do not have because cardiac muscle, unlike any other tissue in your body, never gets to rest. Cardiac muscle has to go continuously, waking or sleeping, 24/7, from the time you're born until the time you die. Actually, even before you're born, it starts moving nutrients around. Now, cardiac muscle has special adaptations to make that possible, to keep operating without fatigue. For starters, cardiac muscle is more flexible in what nutrients that it can employ than any other tissue in your body. It's equally adept at processing fats, carbs, or proteins as a source of ATP production. Secondly, cardiac muscle has very rich stores of both oxygen and energy. It stores large amounts of glycogen, more so than most muscle, to have an energy reserve, a glucose reserve. Secondly, it stores large amounts of oxygen, considerably more oxygen than is normal for most of the tissues in your body. It contains a pigment called myoglobin, myoglobin. Myoglobin is the oxygen-storing pigments found in heart muscle and all found in all muscle, really. It turns a very deep red color when it's storing oxygen, and there is much more myoglobin found in cardiac muscle than there is in any other muscle, making the heart a very deep, dark red color, more so than the brighter red color you find with your skeletal muscle. The heart stores more oxygen, and therefore it can sustain itself longer without aerobic respiration, or without oxygen supply, if oxygen supply is for whatever reduced, so it doesn't have to go anaerobic. Furthermore, cardiac muscle has more and larger mitochondria than other types of muscular tissue. About 25% of the space inside of a cardiac muscle cell is comprised of mitochondria. That gives them a very high capacity for aerobic respiration and therefore for ATP production without having to rely on anaerobic fermentation. All these adaptations together basically mean that cardiac muscle can keep itself going without fatigue, and you don't have to worry about lactic acid buildup or cramping or anything like that, even though the heart never rests. The trade-off, of course, is that cardiac muscle is very demanding in terms of both oxygen and nutrient supply. Gram for gram, your heart burns 10 times the oxygen and glucose of most other tissues in your body. Skeletal muscle burns only about 1/10 as much energy per unit of mass as cardiac muscle. Now, hearts have a couple of important structural features that are the same throughout the animal kingdom. Hearts are divided into distinct chambers in vertebrates. That you have two distinct kinds of chambers found in the vertebrate hearts. You have the atrium, A-T-R-I-U-M. Plural is atria, if there's more than one of them, A-T-R-I-A. Atria are receiving chambers. Whenever blood has circulated through the body, it comes back into the atria. Then you have ventricles, V-E-N-T-R-I-C-L-E. Ventricles are the pumping chambers. They're the ones that then push blood out into the body. So atria receive blood that's already circulated around. Ventricles pump blood, pushing it further along. For that reason, you will find that ventricles typically have a thicker muscular wall. They have to propel the blood forcefully enough to drive it through the body, whereas the atria have very thin walls because they only have to push the blood between themselves and the ventricle, which is attached to them. You will also typically find that hearts feature valves, V-A-L-V-E. A valve is a flap of tissue that prevents backflow. Basically, it ensures that the blood is going to keep on going the direction that it needs to go. Whenever the heart beats or contracts, it forces open the valves, and that allows blood to flow through into the next part of the circulatory pathway, whether that means from atrium to ventricle, or whether that means from ventricle out into the blood vessels leaving the heart. Whenever the heart relaxes, those valves slam shut. They close like trap doors, so it opens up when blood pushes against them, closes whenever the heart relaxes and blood tries to backflow. In that way, we can prevent backflow from happening within the hearts, or back into the heart. We can ensure that the blood goes continuously in one desired direction. Now, we are going to have a lot of variation in the kinds of hearts that we have. We're going to get to that in a moment. Let me lay out the rest of the pathway first. Leaving your heart, you have arteries, A-R-T-E-R-Y, or arteries, I-E-S, plural. Arteries are the efferent vessels of the circulatory system. Remember we talked about nervous systems? Afferent means going towards something. Efferent means going away. E-F-F-E-R-E-N-T. They are the efferent vessels in that they're carrying blood away from the heart. When you think artery, always think going away from the heart. Arteries start off very large at the heart. They branch to smaller and smaller and smaller vessels as they spread throughout the body. They eventually terminate in tiny little vessels called arterioles, A-R-T-E-R-I-O-L-E-S. Our arterioles lead into our next type of blood vessel, the capillaries. Capillaries, C-A-P-I-L-L-A-R-Y, or capillaries, I-E-S. Capillaries are the exchange vessels. Arteries deliver blood throughout the body. Capillaries are where fluid exchange happens. The capillaries have very, very thin walls. They are microscopic blood vessels. You can't see them with the naked eye. They weren't discovered for a very long time. And they are permeating almost every tissue in your body. You typically find them arranged into networks called capillary beds. So it's not just one little capillary by itself. It's a whole little network of up to 100 interconnected capillaries, all weaving throughout a tissue that we call a capillary bed. Capillaries, again, are very thin-walled. Their wall only has like one cell layer thickness, a very thin, simple squamous epithelium, which allows for the easy diffusion of materials. In the capillaries is where nutrient and gas exchange happens. Oxygen and nutrients diffuse from the bloodstream out into the tissue across the capillary walls, and then carbon dioxide and waste molecules, which are often called metabolites, if you don't know that term, M-E-T-A-B-O-L-I-T-E-S. Metabolites are a collective term for all of the chemical wastes produced by our body. Metabolites and carbon dioxide, which I guess is a metabolite, will diffuse through the capillary walls as well, leaving the tissue and entering the bloodstream to be carried away. So capillaries are going to be our exchange vessels. Capillaries terminate with venules, V-E-N-U-L-E-S. Venules carry blood away from the capillaries into our veins, V-E-I-N-S. Veins are the afferent vessels of circulation. Veins are going to be carrying materials back to the heart. They start off very, very tiny, just as arterioles are technically the tiniest arteries. Venules are technically the tiniest veins, but their pathway is opposite that, whereas arteries started off big, leaving the heart, and branched into smaller and smaller and more numerous ones. Veins start off really tiny at the capillary beds, but they gradually converge. They merge with one another, and they form larger and larger and larger veins as they converge and flow together, like tributaries flowing into a big river. I'll actually use the term tributary vein, T-R-I-B-U-T-A-R-Y. If you don't know the term tributary, in geography, a tributary is a little river or stream that flows into a bigger one. In your body, a tributary vein is a littler vein that flows into a bigger one. So our veins converge on larger and larger and larger ones until only a couple of very large veins flow back to the heart. So normally our pathway here is we have veins carry blood into the atrium. Atrium carries blood into a ventricle. Ventricle sends the blood out into arteries. Arteries branch down into arterioles. Arterioles send blood into capillaries. Blood exits capillaries after gas exchange and fluid exchange through venules. Venules flow into veins, which then go back to the atria of the heart. That is our basic circulatory loop that, with very few exceptions, is followed in all parts of all vertebrate bodies. So that's the parts laid out. I wanted to lay out all the parts before I started talking about how different vertebrates do this, because not all vertebrates do this exactly the same way. Closed circulatory systems have the things I just described in common, but that doesn't mean they have everything in common. Closed circulatory systems show a lot of variation, and most of it depends on how the heart itself is organized. The simplest vertebrate hearts are those found in fishes, eels, and other simple aquatic vertebrates. The heart of a fish is a two-chambered heart. One atrium, one receiving chamber, one ventricle, one pumping chamber. Here's how it works with fish. Blood comes into the heart through the atrium. It is then passed into the ventricle. From there, the ventricle pumps it out into the fish's body. The fish's circulation has two steps. First, we have what is called gill circulation, G-I-L-L. Gill circulation sends the blood from the heart through arteries into the capillaries located in the fish's gills. Remember, gills are the respiratory organs of fishes. That's how the fish extracts oxygen from the water. We'll talk more about how they work in our section on the respiratory system. But anyhow, though, so gill circulation delivers the blood from the ventricle first and foremost to the gills. Within the gills, there are going to be capillaries where we're going to engage in gas exchange. The blood is going to unload carbon dioxide, which will diffuse out through the gills into the water, and it will load oxygen, which comes in through the gills and then enters the capillaries. That blood is now oxygenated. From the gills, we then move into another set of arteries, which we call the systemic circulation of the fish. Systemic circulation takes that oxygenated blood, spreads it out through the fish's body, distributes it to systemic capillary beds. S-Y-S-T-E-M-I-C, systemic meaning throughout the system, throughout the body. Systemic capillary beds are found throughout all of the animal's tissues, therefore giving them the gas and nutrient exchange that they need. In the systemic capillaries, we are going to unload oxygen to the tissue, and we're going to load up on carbon dioxide, picking up deoxygenated blood from the tissue. Picking up waste from the tissue. So the blood that leaves the systemic capillaries is going to be deoxygenated. Now that blood enters the animal's veins and makes its way back to the atrium of its heart. Now, that's a pretty efficient pathway, right? Two-chambered heart, send the blood to the gills, get oxygen, send the blood to the systemic capillaries, distribute oxygen, send the blood back to the heart. Sounds good, right? Straightforward. Nice little loop. However, problem with this loop, twofold. One, you have to pass through two separate capillary beds along the way. If you're passing through capillary beds, these are smaller vessels. The further the blood gets from the heart, the less the pressure of the blood matters. In other words, the force of that pressure diminishes as the blood gets further and further away from the pump, just like any pumping mechanism. Now, what this means is that by the time the blood passes into the capillaries, it's lost a lot of its pressure. It doesn't regain that pressure after the capillaries because there's no second pump. And then it has to go through another bed of capillaries, which slows it down further. What this means is that overall, fish circulation is a lot slower than it would be if there was some other way of renewing the force of the heart between picking up on oxygen and distributing it to the body. That limits the metabolic rate of the animal, and this is the reason that virtually all fishes are cold-blooded rather than warm-blooded. We discovered one warm-blooded fish. We started studying to learn what circulatory tricks it's doing to achieve that, but this is a fundamental limiting factor that means a fish has to be cold-blooded. Furthermore, because all the oxygen is picked up at one end of the system, you're not getting as effective oxygenation. You're basically steadily diminishing your oxygen supply throughout, and then you have to carry the blood through a big, basically useless chunk of circulation to get to the gills in the first place to oxygenate them, and then carry the process on. So this is not as efficient as you could be with other ways of organizing your hearts. Now let's step up to another step. Let's talk about amphibians and reptiles. And I'm going to use the word reptile here rather than sauropodomorph. Remember, we talked about how really the class Reptilia and the class Aves, the birds and the reptiles, should technically be fused into one single taxonomic group because birds are technically dinosaurs. Ergo, we often group them together, or at least those biologists like myself who are arguing for this, into a single collective clade called the class Sauropodomorpha, 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 which is the collective group in which the birds are properly classified as a member of order Dinosauria, rather than being a separate class of life. But in this case, I'm retaining the usage reptile for the simple reason that birds and non-bird sauropodomorphs have different ways of circulating blood. So when I use the word reptile here, I'm using it in the classical sense. I am deliberately excluding birds from it. We do not know about the non-avian dinosaurs. We are not sure about the circulatory systems of dinosaurs that were not birds, but there's good reason to suspect that at least some of them also had a different way of doing things than modern reptiles do, circulatory-wise. We know for a fact that the circulation of pterosaurs, your flying reptiles, which remember are not dinosaurs, and your aquatic reptiles like your ichthyosaurus and your plesiosaurus also had different kinds of circulation from modern reptiles, more like that of modern birds, but we'll get to them in a few minutes. But among living reptiles, in the sense that we understand it with the birds left out, and among amphibians, we have a three-chambered heart. The three-chambered heart features two separate atria, two receiving chambers for blood, but only one pumping chamber, one ventricle. Two atria, one ventricle. What happens is that you actually have in amphibians and reptiles what we call double circulation. There are two distinct circulatory paths through the body. Each of them starts from one of the two atria, but those two atria both feed into a common ventricle. They both empty their contents into a single common pumping chamber. Now, from that one ventricle, we have a forked artery that goes in two distinct directions. That forked artery leads to the two separate circuits in circulation for a reptile or an amphibian. The left branch and the right branch do different jobs. The right branch of amphibian and reptile circulation is called the, okay, let me back up a second. That's in amphibians. Let's talk about them first. In amphibians, the right branch leading away from that ventricle goes to the pulmocutaneous circuits. Pulmocutaneous. Pulmocutaneous. Pulmo from pulmonary for lung. Cutaneous means skin, or having to do with the skin. The pulmocutaneous circuit has the function of oxygenating the blood. Its exclusive job is to engage in gas exchange. So blood in the pulmocutaneous circuit goes to the lungs of the amphibian, that is the pulmonary part, and the cutaneous part is the blood supply that goes to the skin. We're going to talk more about this when we talk about respiratory systems, but amphibians are able to engage in a lot of gas exchange across their skin. Their skin is basically a respiratory membrane. They actually get more oxygen through their skin than they do through their lungs. Most amphibians have very small lungs, and a couple of kinds of amphibians don't have lungs at all. So either way, we send the blood to the lungs, if they are there, and to the skin, where gas exchange happens. Oxygen is loaded, and then carbon dioxide is unloaded. That blood then makes its way back to the heart, where it re-enters the heart through the left atrium. Left atrium receives the oxygenated blood from the pulmocutaneous circuit. Now, if you're a reptile, you can't engage in gas exchange across your skin in most instances. There's one limited exception. I'll talk about that later. But in general, reptiles can't do that. So reptiles, rather than having a pulmonary circuit, rather than having a pulmocutaneous circuit, reptiles have a pulmonary circuit. exiting the right side of their hearts. The pulmonary circuit, P-U-L-M-O-N-A-R-Y, pulmonary meaning having to do with the lungs, directs the deoxygenated blood to the reptile's lungs. We engage in gas exchange there. We unload carbon dioxide, we load oxygen, and then we deliver that blood back in a loop that carries it to the left ventricle. So in either case, the pulmonary circuit or the pulmocutaneous circuit, the entire purpose of that circulatory loop is to go to the respiratory organs, get oxygen, dump carbon dioxide, and then return to the left side of the animal's heart. Now, talk about the left side. The left side is the systemic circuits, blood that goes out the left branch of that forked artery. I think I actually went this way when I was talking about it before. Right branch, left branch, looking at myself backwards on the screen. And that, by the way, is an important point about anatomical diagrams. When you are looking at an anatomical diagram in a textbook or whatever, mirror image flip it in your head. Unless otherwise stated, assume that an anatomical diagram, this is a standard throughout the biosciences, assume that an anatomical diagram says that you are looking head on at the subject, that you are facing the subject you are looking at. For that reason, right and left are flipped. This is the right side of my body. This is the left side of my body. But compared to you looking at me, you should be seeing those things on the opposite sides of your body. You know, the anatomical diagram has everything mirror imaged. So keep that in mind. So I was thinking like the diagram there. But okay, so right side of the body, right side of the animal's heart goes to the pulmonary or pulmocutaneous circuit, depending on whether you're a reptile or an amphibian. Left side of the heart goes to the systemic circuit. The systemic circuit delivers blood to the tissues of the body. We have systemic capillaries in the tissues, just like there were pulmonary capillaries, I should have said that, pulmonary capillary beds in the lungs and in the skin that engaged in that gas exchange. So there are going to be systemic capillary beds throughout the animal's body in which oxygen is unloaded to the tissue, carbon dioxide is picked up. Then the deoxygenated blood is going to return to the animal's hearts and re-enter through the right atrium. So we have two distinct pulmonary loops in reptiles and amphibians. We have two distinct circulatory loops. We have a pulmonary or pulmocutaneous circuit served by the right side of the animal's heart, whose job is to pick up oxygen. We have a systemic circuit served by the left side of the heart, whose job is to deliver oxygen. And each of them returns their blood, once the job has been done, to the opposite side of the heart. This is more efficient because we're renewing the pumping force after oxygen has been picked up before we distribute it to the body. By renewing the pumping force, we drive the oxygen more effectively through the body. We're circulating more forcefully. And as a result, we're more efficiently getting gas exchange and nutrient exchange to the tissues, rather than losing all the force because we have two consecutive capillary beds without a pump in between. We go back to the pump in between picking up oxygen and sending it out, and therefore we renew the force of the blood. That means that amphibian and reptile circulation is more efficient in terms of getting gas and nutrient supply out, able to maintain a higher activity level. It's also more effective at distributing oxygen because we have one separate loop for oxygenating the blood and another separate loop for delivering the blood. That's what the benefit of double circulation is. There is a drawback, and the drawback is that both of those atria feed into one shared ventricle. In other words, we are mingling oxygenated and deoxygenated blood in the common pumping chamber. As a result, some of the blood that ends up bearing off to the left for the systemic circuit, some of that blood is a little deoxygenated because there was mixed blood in the ventricle. Some of the blood going off to the right in the pulmonary circuit is already oxygenated. In other words, it can't pick up more oxygen right now. So it's not as efficient as it could be because we have a mingling of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Now, because there are two separate streams, because of fluid dynamics, for reasons of physics, hydrodynamics I'm not going to get into, most of the blood that bears right will still be deoxygenated. Most of the blood that bears left will still be oxygenated, but the simple fact of the matter is they are mixed in the shared ventricle. And that means we are not delivering oxygen or picking up oxygen as efficiently as we otherwise could. It's better than fish It's not as good as you or I. And this is another reason why your reptiles and your amphibians, at least in the sense that we understand that I've described here, must be cold-blooded animals, because they cannot maintain the high energy demands of a warm-blooded metabolism precisely because of the way that their circulation works. So this is a very important adaptation difference in warm-blooded versus cold-blooded. Now, you will find that some animals, certain reptiles, are going to have a partial septum down the middle of that shared ventricle. Turtles, snakes, and lizards are going to have a partial septum dividing that ventricle, which means that they are going to have better separation of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood than amphibians, which lack a septum at all. And therefore, reptiles are basically capable of maintaining larger body size and higher metabolism than amphibians are, although they're still cold-blooded. Crocodilians, your alligators, your caimans, your crocodiles, actually have a fully divided ventricle. They have distinct left and right ventricles. They have a 4-chambered heart. And as a result, they have a complete separation of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, which allows them to be more energetically productive and allows them to be more capable of circulating fully oxygenated blood to where it needs to go. These animals can maintain a higher activity level. They're still cold-blooded. They still have no internal mechanism for regulating their own temperature, but they can still maintain higher energetic demands than my strictly cold-blooded amphibian can. It is worth noting that crocodilians are the closest living relatives among the surviving reptiles of the non-avian dinosaurs. That strongly suggests that in the early days of dinosaur evolution, that a 4-chambered heart was probably a thing that happened, because we see modern crocodilians have a 4-chambered heart, and modern birds do as well. So that strongly suggests that a great many dinosaurs, if not all dinosaurs, may in fact have had 4-chambered hearts. We do not know precisely when the evolutionary branch-off point happened where that might have been different, but we know crocodilians, birds, and the immediate common ancestor of birds and crocodilians certainly was an animal with a 4-chambered heart among the Dinosauria. So certainly some of the dinosaurs had 4-chambered hearts. We know this for a fact. The birds branched off from them. Flight is metabolically expensive. This is how we know that your pterosaurs had a 4-chambered heart. This is how we know that your air-breathing aquatic reptiles like the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs had a 4-chambered heart. You can't maintain that metabolism any other way. It's conceivable that crocodilians and birds arrived at 4-chambered hearts via convergent evolution. It is true that the organization of their heart chambers is a little different, but it is more likely that they had a common dinosaurian ancestor that shared that 4-chambered heart structure. Whether that was common to all dinosaurs is not a thing that we currently can know, simply because we do not have fossil dinosaur hearts to look at. All right, so that's the 3-chambered heart. You, of course, all mammals, all birds, and crocodilians among the living reptiles have a 4-chambered heart. The 4-chambered heart is the most complex heart. 2 atria, 2 ventricles. There is a complete separation of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. In an animal with a 4-chambered heart, the entire left side of the heart services the pulmonary circuits, sending blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen and unload carbon dioxide, returning it to, wait, did I say left side of the heart? I was wrong, sorry, my bad. Right side of the heart. It's always right is pulmonary, left is systemic, no matter what we're looking at. So right side of the heart in my 4-chambered animal, my mammal or my reptile, I have a right atrium and a right ventricle. Deoxygenated blood comes into the right atrium, is pumped out by the right ventricle, goes to the lungs for gas exchange in the pulmonary capillaries, picks up oxygen, removes carbon dioxide, returns to the left side of the heart by way of the left atrium. Left side of the heart is the systemic circuits. Left side of the heart moves blood from left atrium, pumps it out via left ventricle, distributes it to systemic capillary beds, returns it to the hearts by way of the right ventricle. Complete separation of pulmonary and systemic circuits means that mammals, birds, and crocodilians have the most efficient circulation. They have no mingling of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood under normal circumstances. There is a pathology in which that can happen called blue babies, where the baby has a little hole in the division between the two sides of its heart. Those babies typically die within a couple days of birth. They call them blue babies in the day because they would get blue in the face as they were deoxygenated. Today, that can be surgically corrected if caught in time. But that's the normative pattern for mammals, birds, and crocodilians. That allows a much more efficient metabolism. That allows for effective delivery of oxygen, purely oxygenated blood to the tissues that need it. That is why mammals and birds can maintain a warm-blooded metabolism. A precondition of being an endotherm appears to be having a four-chambered heart with distinct separation of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood on left and right sides, respectively. Cost of that, of course, is more expensive. The more heart chambers you have, the more energetically costly it is to maintain the animal's circulatory system, and the more complex that circulatory system is, and therefore the more prone to external damage and dysfunction. So fishes have a really simple one, less expensive to maintain. Amphibians and reptiles have a slightly more complex one, more costly. Birds and mammals have the most complex four-chambered hearts, which are the most expensive to maintain in terms of the energy costs and the functional maintenance, but allow us to maintain an endothermic metabolism. Okay, so that tells us about the basic organization of vertebrate circulatory systems, but we are not done with circulation yet. In our next lesson, I'm going to talk you through mammalian circulation in particular, show you the step-by-step of how blood circulates in you as a mammal. We're going to talk a little bit about the maintenance of heart activity, how animals regulate their cardiovascular activity. We're going to say a few more words about blood vessels, and we're going to talk about the blood itself as a mechanical fluid for the transport of energy, nutrients, gases, and actually heat as well. All right, but I think this is a good point to leave off. Thank you for your attention. Hope you're all having a good day. I'll talk to you soon.